Well, here we are at the home stretch of our exploration of secular humanistic Jewish philosophy, our intellectual roots and origins. And you could almost describe this class as the culmination of it, because we're going to be talking about the emergence of our specific movement. We finally reached it after exploring all the philosophical backgrounds and all the precursors that teleologically were all pointing in this direction. So we are the culmination of all the history we've been learning. It's a very convenient way to put it. It's not quite how it worked.
Very Christian.
But we have our own founding mythology. We have our own founding mythology too. Some people will tell you the story of how Sherwin Wine, who was a Reform rabbi, met with 8 families in a living room in Birmingham, Michigan, and decided to form the first humanistic congregation, which sprang fully formed like Athena from Sherwin's head, and everything was resolved instantly. And that isn't how it worked. In fact, the initial meeting to form this, what would become the first humanistic congregation, was actually 16 families, and 8 of them weren't interested in this new direction. And it was founded as a Reform Jewish church. If you read the tax filing, that was actually the tax language you used in the days. It was a Reform congregation, and the notices in the newspaper called it a Reform congregation. It wasn't until a few months later that they finally evolved their liturgy and practice and belief structure to really be what you could legitimately call a humanistic congregation. Initially, they used conventional God language, for example, and just said God means the best in man, to use that era's language. But they hadn't fully cleared out the religious prayers of from the service. And even after they had created a fully humanistic congregation, the word hadn't necessarily gotten out about it. And I'll tell you the story about what happened in that process in a little bit. But the point is, the mythology of the 8 families in the living room has its own power, separate from whatever the critical history would produce. Plus, I have to tell you, I know of at least 10 families who claim to be one of the 8 families in that room, just like all the pieces of the True Cross, right, and the people who at Woodstock, and
all the people that saw Hank Aaron break the record.
Yes, right, exactly. Exactly. So, any event has people, and there's even a funny story about a rabbi who was retiring, and one of his older congregants came up to him and said, "Oh, Rabbi, you've been so important in my life for so many years. I still remember the sermon you gave after Robert Kennedy was shot." Except he hadn't been at that congregation when Robert Kennedy was shot. But he's glad she remembered it and how meaningful it was. So, the difference between memory and history. Okay, so speaking of history, let's take us back to the 1960s. This is the post-war period, the Kennedy era, more or less, which is really more the Kennedy plus the Johnson era, yes, right? And what we're finding in Jewish life in this period is a shift in Jewish options. Jews are beginning to move out of cities and more densely populated areas for suburbia, often to very densely Jewish suburbs, in part because they can't get into the other suburbs, in part because they choose to live where other Jews are living. Some of them are pioneers in non-Jewish wildernesses like Deerfield, Illinois, which at the time was mostly fields and not actually developed yet. But part of that move also reflects a Jewish arrival in America. You see, most of the young Jewish families there were born in the U.S. because of the cutoff of the immigration laws in the 1920s. So now, if you're talking in the 1960s, people who were in their 20s and 30s were mostly born here. And so they are much more at root in America, fluent in American life, than their parents or grandparents who were immigrants and had that immigrant experience and lived Jewish language experience. Many of them don't know Yiddish because their parents used Yiddish as a secret language so that they didn't tell them what it meant. But that meant that the kids grew up not knowing Yiddish, and so Yiddish couldn't really be the basis for their own Jewish identity, since it was the secret language, not a living language. Also, as they're moving out, many of them are becoming more affluent. They've gone to American colleges and universities. They have white-collar jobs, not blue-collar jobs. They're working as lawyers and doctors and accountants, and not necessarily as pharmacists or as grocery store owners or as department store. They're on a level up. And of course, as you get more affluent, the previous attractions of socialism become less when you have your own house with 2 cars in the garage. Redistributing wealth when you actually have some is less attractive than when you don't. So they are at home in America, and they're living in these suburban settings. And so if you were secularly inclined, you were not interested in joining your neighborhood reform temple or conservative temple, and you wanted a secular option, either for philosophical reasons or simply because you didn't connect with that religious lifestyle, you really had to either create your own options or accommodate to what was available. And a lot of secularized Jews did wind up joining conservative or reformed congregations because of what was close, what was convenient. Some of them wound up joining Unitarian churches because they were theologically secular, and Unitarians had a strong humanist strain in them, but they still provided community support and benefit. If you could get around the concept of a church that you were a member of, then that worked. I see a couple chants here. No, my family was not one of the 8, and Skokie is one example of these big suburbs that grow in this time period. So really, we're going to talk about 2 directions that wound up reuniting as an organized movement that both were responding to this new reality. The first was coming out of that secular Jewish world from the 1930s that we talked about in a previous class when we talked about the Yiddishists and the Jewish socialists, who were often even explicitly communist before that became as dirty as it did in the 1940s and 50s. Many of them were focused on Jewish culture, on Yiddish language, but actually teaching the kids Yiddish language, not just keeping it as a secret. They wanted them to sing and to read and to even be able to write, all in a fluent Yiddish that would be the basis of a cultural Jewish identity. Now, many of these organizations had to quickly reinvent themselves beginning in the late 1940s with the McCarthy era, because as communism became the red menace and the enemy, you couldn't call yourself a communist anymore and expect to do business with anybody or to be respectable. And certainly for people moving out to the suburbs, getting more affluent, the last thing they want is to be tarred as a red lover or pink or anything in that direction. So a lot of these explicitly communist organizations spun off their Jewish camps, their Yiddish language shulas, as secular Jewish communities and schools. They kept the word secular, which itself was a bit provocative in the era of, a godless communism. Calling yourself secular maybe was already a step too far for some. And so they shrank in size tremendously. But they were still out there. And so those descendants of those Yiddishist organizations and this Jewish left ultimately reoriented themselves in 1970 as the Conference for Secular Jewish Education, organized around schools, because they figured most people who are joining Jewish communities are doing it because they want to give their kids some kind of Jewish education, and they have their friends in their neighborhood they're living in for adult connection, so they may not need as much adult programming, but primarily they want a secular cultural Jewish education for their kids. Ultimately, this organization relabels itself as CSJO, which for a long time was the Congress of Secular Jewish Organizations, so it included both schools and adult communities, but most of it was for schools. And they describe their ideology as secular Jewishness. So what do they mean by that? Well, secular meant not religious, like a secular public square. So it wasn't philosophically anti-supernatural or philosophically non-theistic. It was simply, we don't all agree on religion, so we're going to keep things neutral and not talk about God and religion stuff. If you want to go pray on Yom Kippur, go pray on Yom Kippur in a synagogue. We don't care. It's none of our business. What we do in the community is a shared, lowest common denominator secular. And so that would be a comfortable place for someone who is an atheist, but it might also be a comfortable place for someone who wanted some Yiddish language and culture, but might have some more religious inclinations. And you might write a new, rather than revise the old Hebrew blessing, you might write a new blessing in Yiddish that would fit that secular ideology, but not be in direct competition with the traditional Hebrew blessing. So my mother remembers, and we sing sometimes at our Passover Seders, a blessing on lights that goes, Mir benchen die Licht, we bless the light. And so it's not a direct competition with the Hebrew blessing beginning with Baruch something. It's something very different, so it fits a different category, so to speak. So that's the secular part, is the sort of neutral public square, lowest common denominator, not anti-religion or supernatural, simply focused on this world and what we can know. And remember, in Yiddish, the term for secular was weltlich, which means worldly, like this worldly, but also universal, okay? Now, the second term was Jewishness. Now, why do they use the word Jewishness instead of Judaism? Well, from their perspective, Judaism was an ism. It was a belief system, like Christianity or Islam, conservatism, liberalism. Now, you could also point to examples like Hellenism, which is a cultural identity, not just a ideology, but in general, they preferred a term that was actually a direct translation from the Yiddish. In Yiddish, the way you say how you're Jewish, the quality of being Jewish, is Yiddishkeit. Remember, Yiddish in Yiddish means Jewish, so Jewishness is a direct translation of Yiddishkeit. Jewishness, it's who you are, it's a quality of being, it's your language, your food, your culture, your inheritance, your Jewishness, whatever, however that identity is expressed for you. So they felt more comfortable with the term Jewishness, and when they described where they came from and how they oriented themselves, it combined the progressive politics that they were heirs to from that Jewish left and Yiddish language, along with this general secular public square. So I'll show you an example of a platform statement by one of these communities. This is from, oh, I didn't like that. 1 second. Pin, there we go. So this is from an organization called the Sholem Community in Los Angeles, which has been around since the 1950s. In fact, I had a nice chuckle to myself when I read a history of the founding of the Sholem Community. It said that people decided to start Sholem because the local workmen's circle was too anti-communist. And I thought, the workmen's circle, which is described as a workers' circle that is a clearly socialist organization, if you're too anti-communist for the workers' circle, you are a communist. Like, just take it. So they were definitely on that Jewish left. But you can see how they describe who they are. What is secular Jewishness? The roots of secular Jewishness reach as far back as the prophet's opposition to priestly rituals and social injustice, the liberating rational philosophy of Baruch Spinoza, even the anti-clerical concepts of early Hasidism. So what do you see out of that? They're opposed to priests and clergy, right? That's part of what secular means. It's nothing that smacks of religion, including the authority structure, including the idea that certain people are of a different holiness level.
And the rituals and things.
And the rituals, exactly. So a lot of these early secular Jewish communities didn't do a Rosh Hashanah, didn't do a Yom Kippur, didn't do a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, because those they thought of as religious rituals. Yom Kippur is a day of atonement. And so they would do some things, like they would do Purim, they would do Passover, that they reframed as secular rituals, but they didn't reclaim the rabbi, they didn't reclaim Yom Kippur, fasting, the bar mitzvah even. If you wanted a bar mitzvah in those communities, you hired a rabbi and did it separately. It wasn't part of what the community offered. In fact, even at Sholem, it was really controversial when they brought in doing some kind of group b'nai mitzvah program. That was a big divisive debate within the community, because it was smacked of religion. It was too, it sort of smelled of religion in its origins. Okay, the first secular Jewish organizations arose in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Europe and the Western Hemisphere. These organizations defined the Jews as a people whose history, traditions, values, and cultures could be researched and understood rationally using the methods and insights of modern thought and science. The encompassing term was Yiddishkeit, Jewishness. Okay? So it's claiming the mantle of those early secular Jewish organizations. Also, the insights of modern thought and science, so that rational side of things. We read about that with the Haskalah, we talked about that with the early Reform movement, similar kind of messaging here. From these secularist concepts arose the great Jewish social enterprises of our century: Zionism, communal organization, and the Jewish labor and socialist movements. The most important is the last, of course, in your list, right? So Zionism, yes, okay, but they're not really fans of that. Even going back to, this is bourgeois nationalism, and this is Hebrew, and this is not realistic. There's old antagonisms there. But the Jewish labor socialist movement was very important. That was the mass movement. All the great works of modern Yiddish literature and theater, which form the core of Jewish culture in English and modern Hebrew, so hint, hint, let's go back to the original, are permeated by these secularist concepts, and so too is the overwhelming bulk of Jewish humor, folklore, and folk song. So it's pointing back to these early modern sources as roots for their secular approach, but also as the building blocks for their identity. The ethical value system of secular Jewishness is also derived from these roots. Principles of social and personal justice enunciated by the prophets, and the progressive humanistic concepts still developing in contemporary democratic thought. It draws on understanding from the Jewish historical experience, that the broader and more profound personal social rights and liberties in greater societies where Jews live, the deeper and richer the potentials for continuing development of the Jewish people and its culture. So it's supporting general liberal progressive politics, but also claiming roots on going back to the prophets and their approach to justice. I mean, that's a selective reading of the prophets. Prophets aren't always, our model for things, but this is again one of those, choosing your roots. Therefore, secular Jews have always had a strong commitment, as a matter of enlightened self-interest, to peace, untrammeled civil and personal liberties, and the right of every person, nation, or ethnic group to dignity and self-determination. So this is a sort of universalist approach to human rights. Culturally, secular Jews understand a significant part of these concepts are reflected in Yiddish literature, including poetry, fiction, theater, scientific, philosophical works, and Yiddish folklore. So you see Yiddish, Yiddish, Yiddish all the way through this paragraph as a clear repository of this secular Jewish identity, okay? At a minimum, we seek to show respect for Yiddish and knowledge of Yiddish.
But the use of Yiddish goes way back beyond the Enlightenment, right? I mean,
sure, and it's not limited to secular Jews.
Yeah, by any means.
I mean, keep in mind that the vast majority of Yiddish speakers today are ultra-Orthodox Jews. Yeah. So, this is a particular strand of Yiddish that they're focused on. And it is true that a large part of early modern Yiddish literature is from people leaving Orthodoxy and going out into the secular world. The stories of Shalom Aleichem and Yud Lamed Peretz. I mean, we talked about examples of these in past classes that reflect that secularization process. So they're not making this up.
And when is this written?
This is was on their website in 2008, probably written, sometime before that.
2008.
Yeah. So it's reasonably current. It's not what's on their website now. They've shifted their language a bit, but this is a snapshot in time of one approach to this identity. Okay, so now that's the secular part of secular humanistic Judaism as a broad movement. What about the humanistic part? Well, as I mentioned, the Birmingham Temple, which would become the first humanistic congregation, was started by 8 or 16 families in a living room in Birmingham, Michigan, which is why it got the name the Birmingham Temple. This was in November of 1963. Their rabbi was a rabbi named Sherwin Wine, who had gotten his rabbinic degree at the Hebrew Union College, but had also gone on for graduate study at the University of Michigan in philosophy. And if he had more dedication to footnoting, he might have gotten his PhD done, but he wound up being all but dissertation because he couldn't stand the academic rigmarole. I've even read his rabbinic thesis, and his rabbinic advisor commented, it would benefit from more references, because he tended not to like that stuff, but that was his style. So he was interested in philosophy. He identified as a humanist in his particular school of thought, but he was living and working as a Reform rabbi. But he was becoming impatient with the hoops he had to jump through as a Reform rabbi to try and make it palatable, or to interpret God in a way, or interpret the Torah in a way that worked for Reform Judaism. So when he met with these new families to try and start something new, he supposedly had an idea, a germ of an idea in his mind. I actually talked to one of the people who knew him in this era, and supposedly he said, Rabbi Wine, I like generally the direction you're going, but there's still too much God in this for me. And Sherman supposedly said, give me 3 months. So I don't know how true that is. But the end result is, by the middle of 1964, started in 63, by the middle of 1964, the community has become fully humanistic. And there's even a newspaper reporter who comes and takes extensive notes and writes a long story about this congregation where the rabbi doesn't focus on a God and the services don't mention God, but it's still a Jewish congregation. But then there's a newspaper strike, and the writers don't cross the picket lines, and so the story sits for 3 months. And it isn't until the winter of 1964 that the news story comes out in the Detroit News, I think it was Detroit News, and then the stuff hits the fan, so to speak. Rabbi Wine is actually called before a meeting of the Michigan Board of Rabbis and is interrogated, and they ask him point blank, are you an atheist? And his actual perspective was something later called agnostic, which is, I don't know if there's a God, there's no way to prove if there's a God or not. So what he basically said was, well, if what you mean by atheist is what most people mean by atheist, then yes, I'm an atheist. Headline in the newspaper, Rabbi, I am an atheist, right? Not, no context for that.
Nothing ever changes.
And again, that creates a lot of controversy. Some people are appalled to hear about a fraud being perpetrated on Jews by calling this a congregation when the rabbi is an atheist. But other people are intrigued by this because they come from a congregational experience background and like the ideas of a congregation, but don't believe in the theology. And this is in the same era, in the mid-1960s, of what was called the God is Dead movement in Protestant theology, where you had Protestant theologians who said after the Holocaust, and given what we know about science, there really is no space for a God in the modern mind. And so now what do? We still have to move forward. So it's of a piece with that moment. And enough people are interested that by the end of the 1960s, by 1969, they founded something called the Society for Humanistic Judaism, which connects other communities, including a congregation in suburban Chicago, which is the ancestor of Kol Hadash, and another congregation in Connecticut, which was formed by people from Detroit who moved to Connecticut and wanted something like what they had back in Michigan. But they had to deal with a lot of controversies. What does it mean to have a rabbi if the rabbi is not someone teaching you about God? Do you call it a synagogue, or is that a misnomer? Are you leading people astray? Do you call your gathering services? You're not serving anybody. I mean, maybe you're serving food at the end, but you're not serving a God, could you even call it Judaism if what you're doing is a cultural Jewish identity or a historic Jewish peoplehood, but not the ideology of Torah and Revelation and all those pieces that are conventionally thought of as religious Judaism? Now, they ultimately settled on the title Humanistic Judaism because they wanted a positive statement of what they did believe in: human responsibility, human knowledge, human power, human potential. And they were comfortable using the language of Judaism because they felt they were in the spectrum of Jewish religious practice. They just saw themselves as a humanistic version of Jewish religion, just like Unitarianism had a strand of a humanistic approach to the Unitarian Church. So if you look at the core principles of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, these were adopted in 1999. There's a new version of them that came out last year, but this is fine for our purposes. So here's an example of how they demonstrate their core principles. We affirm our identity as members of the Jewish people. We draw strength from the history, culture, and achievements of our people. We see Jewish history as testimony to the continuing struggle for human dignity and a product of human decisions and actions. So we are connected to the Jewishness as an ethnic identity, as a peoplehood identity, but Jewish history does not prove a God. It works by what happens to people, right? It's a naturalistic phenomenon. We demonstrate our bond to the Jewish people through humanistic celebrations of Jewish holidays and life cycle events. We create and use non-theistic Jewish ritual services and celebrations. They don't say anything about God in here explicitly, but it's alluded to in the description of history as happening by human actions, and that the rituals we do are non-theistic. So not focused on a God, not anti-God, but simply not focused on a God. That invoke the ethical core of Jewish history, literature, and culture. Our aim is to foster a positive Jewish identity, intellectual integrity, that's to say what you believe what you say, and ethical behavior among celebrants. We affirm the value of study and discussion of Jewish and universal human issues. So all knowledge is important to us. Use sources such as reason, observation, experimentation, creativity, and artistic expression to address questions about the world and seek to understand our experiences. So this is, how do we know what we know? Again, you can hear a very philosophical tone to this in talking about epistemology and talking about defining your categories, where the secular Jewishness one was not as philosophically defined. This is on ethics. We seek solutions to human conflict that respect the freedom, dignity, and self-esteem of every human being. We make ethical decisions based on our assessment of the consequences of our actions. A kind of consequentialist ethic, straight out of philosophy, and like the secular Jewishness, a universalist approach to ethics, right? Human conflicts should respect the rights of every person and not privilege one particular group. Human beings have the responsibility for solving human problems. We are committed in the enduring Jewish tradition of support for social action and social progress to community service and actions for social justice. We take responsibility for our behavior and for the state of our... So again, a general progressive ideology, a little bit less explicit, but still there. And finally, we are committed to passing on these values through education and by our example. And just to show you a couple examples of how they demonstrated that ideology when they actually were able to create a community, I'm going to show you a couple pictures. This is a picture of Sherwin Wine here. This is in the 1990s. This is in the library. And you can see what's in the library. Their Torah scroll, because it's a book. It's a book by people, and so it belongs with the other books by people. Now, this was on extreme reference. You could not check it out. There was no card in the card catalog, right? And actually, when I started working there, it was so unused that it had cobwebs on it because it hadn't been moved in a long time. They simply didn't use it as part of the ritual. It was in the library, but once they shifted to a different style of Bar Mitzvah celebration, which we talk about more in our Jewish culture class, they didn't really have use for the Torah. Now, once I started working there, and some other of our rabbinic students wanted to make this less of a mystery, so we took it out to show our students what it looked like, because otherwise they would have never seen the inside of a Torah scroll. So we made it, theirs by taking it out and showing it to them what it looks like. It shouldn't be a mystery to them, but this is the ideology, was to put it into the library, and then in the sanctuary, in its place, you have the Hebrew word behind his head. It's Adam, which means humanity. So instead of an ark at the center of the sanctuary, it was the word Adam, humanity. And it's not that we were bowing and worshiping humanity, but that was the center of our focus. And in fact, the architecture of the building was relatively low ceilings, no high sweeping, draw your eyes above and beyond. It was in a sort of prairie-style architecture, keep your mind focused on this world and this life. The beam of the stage was not that far removed from the audience. It was all part of the ideology. And you may or may not recognize one of the partners in this wedding. Happens to be my wedding. So this gives you some idea of the ideology, the expression in the building, and the creation of this community. Now, the Birmingham Temple building was built in 1971. They did the groundbreaking in 71, maybe it was finished in 73, but in the early 1970s, they built the building. They added on in the 1980s and 1990s, added a school building, but it was a very large congregation for the Detroit area, around 400 to 500 families, which is a good size for that community. But Wine was also interested in building bridges to the broader world. He helped to found, for example, something called the Humanist Institute, which was designed to train humanist leaders for the Humanist Unitarians, for the American Humanist Association, and for the American Ethical Union, which is the ethical culture organizations. So beginning in the early 1980s, he was working with these general humanist educators to train humanist leaders. But he realized that he was also interested in training Jewish-specific leaders that could serve humanistic Jewish communities. So the first step was he created, in conjunction with the Congress of Secular Jewish Organizations, an organization called the Leadership Conference of Secular and Humanistic Jews. And this leadership conference comprised leaders of various communities who were fulfilling the same kind of functions that he was in various congregations. But the idea was that they could collaborate, issue statements of purpose, and maybe help to train or certify new leaders who could help to run communities and also legally perform weddings and other functions for people. In 1985, at a conference in Jerusalem, a new institution was founded called the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. The thought would be this would be an intellectual center, publishing materials and providing the training programs that the leadership conference would then certify the leaders from. So you get an education at one institution and a professional certification from the leadership conference. That was the idea. And the very next year, in 1986, a new organization was founded, another new organization was founded, called the International Federation of Secular Humanistic Jews. And this was supposed to be an umbrella of community organizations that represented the secular and humanistic Jewish population. So you had the communities of the CSJO and the Society for Humanistic Judaism, SHJ, in North America. You had a secular Jewish community center, Centre Communautaire Les Juifs, in Brussels, that was a member. There were secular Jewish groups in Moscow, in Argentina, in Mexico City, and a couple of other places, and in Israel, that would be constituent members of this international federation. The International Institute initiated a leadership training program in 1988 to train leaders to fit in that leadership conference. And then ultimately, in 1992, it started its own rabbinic program to train humanistic rabbis. That's actually the program that I graduated from. and now I run as the head for North America of the Institute. Now, these later organizations were in collaboration with both CSJO and SHJ, so they included elements of both secular Jewishness and humanistic Judaism, both the shul, school-focused style, and the full congregation style that could include a Sunday school, but would be modeled more on a religious style community. And sometimes those two differing approaches cohabited well, and sometimes the anti-clericalism of the secularist approach clashed with the rabbinic privilege approach of Sherwin Wine, or for that matter, Rabbi Dan Friedman, who was our Rabbi Emeritus at Kol Hadash. They came out of an era where the rabbi was the authority, and so they inhabited that role in that way, which didn't always mesh well with the absolute democracy of the secularist community model. So there were personality clashes and whatever else, but by and large, the organizations have collaborated enough that we're still together. Even as some of the affiliated communities are smaller than they were in their heyday. But the end result is we do have this broader umbrella movement where you have sort of sub-movements of the CSJO and SHJ organizations in parallel with collaborative efforts through the Institute, and for a time the Federation, though the Federation isn't really active or in existence anymore. There's a legacy website up about it, but not any great detail. So as one last way to approach this modern movement expression, I want to show you a few texts from our Judaism in a Secular Age anthology by the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai. Amichai was actually explicitly part of our movement. In many ways, he received an award of lifetime achievement at our very first colloquium in 1995. And he also articulated in many ways, and in poetic ways, our approach to Jewish life and to everyday human experience. So this is one of our favorite poems we use in my community periodically, called My Head, My Head. When my head got banged on the door, I screamed, my head, and I screamed, door, door. And I did not scream mother and not God, nor did I speak of the vision of the end of days, of a world where there will be no heads and doors anymore. When you stroked my head, I whispered, my head, and I whispered, your hand, your hand. And I did not whisper mother and not God, and I did not see wonderful visions of hands stroking heads in the opening heavens. Whatever I scream and speak and whisper is to comfort myself. My head, door, door, your hand, your hand. That's the human experience. It's my subjective experience. It's my confrontation with the uncompromising, real material world out there that doesn't care what happens to me.
Shingles doesn't care.
Yeah, but you do. And your hand is what provides the comfort that I need. So it's a nice sort of summary statement, but in poetic language. Another example is, I feel good in my trousers. If the Romans hadn't glorified their victory with the Arch of Titus, we wouldn't know the shape of the menorah from the temple. But we know the shape of Jews because they multiplied unto me. I feel good in my trousers, in which my victory is hidden, even though I know I'll die, and even though I know the Messiah won't come. I feel good. I'm made from remnants of flesh and blood and leftovers of philosophies. I'm the generation of the pot bottom. Sometimes at night when I can't sleep, I hear the hard spoons scratching and scraping the bottom of the pot. But I feel good in my trousers. I feel good. Historical inheritance is a burden sometimes. It's, deep and it's painful. But sometimes you learn something from it, and sometimes you can just enjoy life. You feel good wearing your pants. What does he mean in which my victory is hidden? I feel good in my trousers. What's his victory? The power to generate, right? The power for future life. It's what's hidden in his trousers, literally. But it's the idea
that, but I didn't know.
It's the idea that even if the Messiah won't come, even though I know I'll die, my victory is guaranteed, is assured, because we have this power of life. And the last one, Sabbath lie. On Friday at twilight of a summer day, while the smells of food and prayer rose from every house, and the sound of the Sabbath angel's wings was in the air, while still a child, I started to lie to my father. I went to another synagogue. I don't know if he believed me or not. But the taste of the lie was good and sweet on my tongue, and in all the houses that night hymns rose up along with lies to celebrate the Sabbath. And in all the houses that night Sabbath angels died like flies in a lamp, and lovers put mouth to mouth, blew each other up until they floated upward or burst. And since then the lie has been good and sweet on my tongue. Since then I always go to another synagogue. And my father returned the lie when he died. I've gone to another life. It's sad, right? That this life is it, that's all there is. But maybe we choose another synagogue. It's a synagogue of lived experience. It's a synagogue of love, a synagogue of exploration. And it's a lie, but it's not a lie to yourself if you find another synagogue that's meaningful. So, any thoughts, comments, questions on that before we go into our last few discussion questions from the packet?
What I'm struck by is if you take, the Jewish references out of it, it's exactly what I learned in ethical culture. I mean, it's really precisely the same sort of language and such.
Right. Well, this is the case where there's a couple different ways that we can present our approach. One is that our ethnic culture is Jewish and our philosophy is humanism. And in that, our philosophy is going to be the same as a humanist Unitarian and a humanist ethical culture and the Council for Secular Humanism and all these other varieties of secular ideologies. The other way that some have presented it is our humanism comes from the Jewish experience. So it's not an accident that we're quoting Jewish sources or talking about Jewish history or referencing Jewish holidays when we're talking about our humanism. We're learning it from that background. Now, of course, this is a case where you're right and you're right. You don't have to pick one. There are times that the philosophy we learned from, Bertrand Russell, who had not a Jewish drop of blood in his pedigree or his body, pure, English philosophical school, but a wonderful articulator of a humanistic approach to life. And there are other times where the ethic of, pay your worker their wages the same day and not withholding them, that's a humanistic ethic, and it's directly from Jewish sources, not something you derive from pure reason and humanistic philosophy. So there are times where our humanism does come from our Jewish roots, and or our understanding of the Jewish experience of the Holocaust for many people was the final nail in the coffin of believing in providence or an intervening God in the world. And that's it's a human experience, but it's also particularly a Jewish traumatic experience. So this is one of those cases where it's yes and both the humanism and the Jewish cultural context.